let's go into a 3D Studio Max viewport. As I said, we will discuss right now here in this session the OpenVDB fracture operator. And the OpenVDB fracture operator allows you to create fracture effects or break up or cut objects into pieces. Or I have to say volumes, not objects, volumes. We need to work on volumes because OpenVDB is all about volumes. So why would you want to work with volumes? Volumes have a huge advantage. When you cut them and slice them and dice them and do all crazy things to the volume, it usually stays all watertight. There will be no errors, no flipping faces or missing faces or situations where the Boolean operations, for example, don't work or anything like that. With volumes, there's no issue at all because they're mathematical described objects, and they can be cut really accurate because it's plain mathematics that defines the objects and also modifies the objects. But let's have a look at the scene right now. As usual, I'll turn off thinking particles so that we know what's in the scene and what we're working with. So simple scene so that everyone can follow, nothing too complex. We just want to explore the operators and what they do. So we have these two box objects, two dummy objects, as we can see here, placed here inside of the box object, the main box object, and that's it. So this is our whole scene we have here. Let me turn on thinking particles. So the first thing we see here is, when we zoom in here, we have the box object, our original box object here. When I turn that on, you can see a slight difference. When I zoom in, you see the difference between our original object. And this is, when I turn to wireframe, you will see that's our volume representation of the box object. So right now what we did here is we turned the box into a volume, and this is the first step you would always have to do, is turn your objects, your 3D Studio objects, into a volume. So how do we do that? We have to get first all the objects into thinking particles so that we can work on them. For that I use my robust and workhorse called object to particle, my most favorite operator. It seems it brings the objects into thinking particles, then we can work on them. So what we do here is pretty simple. We pick an object in the scene. We picked the box 01 object, and the important part here is we put box 01 into the group source. So I created these particle groups. Thinking Particles stores or manages particles in groups, and you can have nested groups and all kinds of hierarchical setups here. So I have a source, segments, cutter, and cutter instance. These are my particle groups. So the first object I get into thinking particles is my main box, the big box here, and we put them and store this particle in the source particle group. The important part is here the instance shape, because I need the surfaces so that we can turn this mesh object into a volume. The next object I get in lands in the cutter particle group. So the box 2 is my cutter object, so I want to slice or cut the volume with it. So my cutter object gets into it, and we also use the instance shape in here because we need to turn this into a volume as well, so we need the mesh. Then I get in the dummy object, both dummy objects, and they all get into the cutter instance group. So we have two particles in our cutter instance group. By the way, there's an easy method to check how many particles are in your groups if they actually have been created. When you click your particle group, it says branch and selected. So you can have the summary of the branch you've selected or just the selected particle group. then this will give you the number of particles for the selected particle group. So we can also go to the cutter, we see 1, and in source we see 1 as well, because we have these two mesh objects, these two boxes, and here we brought in the two dummy objects. So everything is now in 3D Studio Max. For the dummy objects, it makes no sense to have the instance shape because there's no shape or faces on the dummy object. So now that we have all the objects inside of thinkingParticles along with their meshes and all the information a mesh has, we can start working on our visual effects. First thing with OpenVDB, like in all of my other videos, is the first thing you need to create is the OpenVDB container node or satellite node. Why do we call it container or satellite node? This OpenVDB node can be placed in any dynamic set on this side here, anywhere in any hierarchy you want. It's accessible from all the other operators that need access to the OpenVDB. Right through all the dynamic sets. However, I like to keep things organized and all in one dynamic set, but keep in mind it's not mandatory. These satellite operators, they can go everywhere and you can access the information from everywhere. So what do we do with the OpenVDB container node? The OpenVDB container node allows you to create the volume grids you want to work with. And be careful, it does not actually create the volume grid or the data or any data. It just manages what you want and what is existing or should exist when the volume data is created. So it's kind of, as I said, a container that lists all the volume grids you want to work with. Creating new volume grids is very simple and easy. Let's say, for example, we wanted to create a fog volume. You just go and create the fog volume. You can rename that with a simple long click. That's Windows standard, and say my foggy fog. And then you can access your volume grid. As you see, it instantly updates everywhere. It can be accessed with the name you specified, my foggy fog here. And same deal, if we remove that, it disappears from all the operators that can access these container node. So now that we have decided we want a distance field, and what is a distance field? Let me just repeat that as well. So when we have a mesh object and turn that into a volume, like a box, for example, in 3D Studio Max, these are just faces in space. It's not a real volume. It has no information or knowledge about any volume or whatsoever. So to turn the mesh into a volume, we need a thing that's called signed distance field. And what it does is it saves or stores in every point in space. So you have your grid with a specific raster. In these grid points, it stores the distance to the surface. And then it decides if it's a negative, it means it's inside the object, and if it's positive, it's outside the object, and if it's exact 0 or gets close to 0, it means it's on the surface. So this is how meshes or mesh objects that are not volumetric are turned into a volume representation. And then you can adjust how accurate this conversion should be, how much detail you want to save and use, and all these kind of things. So that's what we need, the signed distance field. So how do we actually then create the volume data? How do we turn a mesh into a volume? That's done with the shape to volume VDB operator. The shape to volume VDB operator does the hard job of having your faces and turning them into a volume. So what you first need to do is you need to decide which satellite node you want to access, because the satellite node, in this case OpenVDB, stores or has the fields you want to create or work with. And the next thing is we need to say or define where do we store the volume data. So where do we store the volume data? And thinkingParticles works particle based, is a simulation procedural effect system, so everything is attached to a particle. So that's a huge difference in concept from other applications that might use OpenVDB as well. Thinking Particles OpenVDB implementation is very flexible and powerful. Keep that in mind. It might be confusing at first, but volume data is attached to a particle. Keep that in mind. So we have to decide, okay, where do I store or get my volume data? And we specify the source particle group. And in the source particle group, we stored the long mesh object, the box in there. The only thing left is, where do I want to store my information? I want to store it in the distance field, or actually create a distance field for me. And this distance field is handled by the OpenVDB container. And then we can specify other fields if we want it. But the next important step is, what is the resolution of this field? How accurate do I want to turn this mesh representation into a mesh, into a volume? And then I specify the bandwidth, the narrow band. So it searches where the surface is, and now we say we want 3 voxels outside of the surface and 3 voxels inside of the surface. So that's enough to create our surface or represent our surface in the volume. So it's always a good idea to name the things as they are. So we say that's our source box. So that's the main box we want to cut or fracture. And the next volume we want to create is our cutter object, the big box that is cutting through the other object. So same deal. We define, okay, get from OpenVDB the field names we want to use. Use the cutter object here now instead as from our particle groups. So we store at the cutter particle, we store the volume information. We want the assigned distance field because we want to work with it, and we want to set the resolution and define the narrow band for creating the surface information inside of the volume. So right now it's remarkable, or one thing I want to remark here is we have a different resolution for our cutter object than our main object. So we will explore this in a second and actually visualize what this means. Here we have the resolution of 2, and our other object, the source box, has the value of 2.54. So same deal here. Let's just name the things over there. Cutter, volume. Let me actually rename that as also volume, so we know this is our volume we create here. So we create the source box volume and the cutter volume. Also, it is important that you keep track on your order of operators. So we need to first create the volumes to work with it. If those operators were at the end of our tree view, it would mean we would have no volume, so we can't work with it. So they need to be pretty on top of it, so that you first change your meshes into volume, and then you can work on the volume. So now let's have a look what we have here. So we have turned this box into a volume, and it would be maybe interesting to visualize the volume. So here we have a ShowVDB that actually helps us in visualizing the volume data in 3D Studio Max in a very efficient way. Let's just activate this ShowVDB, and we can see something happened. We have this large bounding box, and we see some dots in here. Let me just, for better visualization, turn off the mesh representation. So I turned off the mesh representation, and now we can see this is our rasterized volume of the box. So this is how OpenVDB turned the box mesh into a volume. So every one of these points is storing now the distance to the surface. And we are now visualizing only the interior points. So that's the inside of the volume. We can also activate the outside, the exterior. And now you might ask, what is outside, inside? Why is outside so small and inside a little bit more, and all this kind of things? Remember, I said we can define how many voxels we want to have outside and how many voxels we want to have inside. And this is actually what we did here. So that's the outside area, and this is our inside. Next thing is, here we can visualize now our original volume. Let's go to the cutter volume. I want to see our cutter volume as well. Remember, the cutter volume was our box 2. That's this box here, just standing there. So I want to visualize this volume as well. So I go here and enable this. And let's have a look. That's the segments. We don't want that. And enable this. That's our, let me select that, cutter volume. So, and you immediately saw here is the volume representation of our cutter volume. And as you can see, the resolution of our cutter volume is much lower than the resolution of the main object. So we can have that internally. We try to convert from one volume resolution to the other volume resolution. When you do effects, visual effects with OpenVDB, usually the big restriction is that all volumes have to be the same size and resolution, or all the mathematics won't function and work. So what we automatically do is we convert from one to the other. Here we have the cutter volume. Keep that in mind. So if we were to adjust our resolution, let me just do that to 2.54 like the other one, and we simulate again, we will see now we have a much finer resolution of our volume. So now we have the same resolution as this box. However, as I said, there's no need for that. It works with different resolutions. We just convert it. Just keep in mind, sometimes that might create strange effects. So it's always a good idea to have as close as possible the resolution of your volumes. Also, I would like to just represent the visualization in a different color so that we know this is our cutter object. And here we have our cutter object in a different color. And now we are going to have our first operator to use this information to cut the object actually. And I'm going to disable the volume representation, and I'm going back to enable our mesh representation so we can actually see what's going on. So what we have here is, let me just dive in here. In this setup, we use the following. We have a time interval. So at frame 0, I want to do the cutting. Not all the time, every subframe or every substep. I just want to cut the object in frame 0, and then we could work with it. So we have the get grid here. Let me activate that. So now this whole chain is active. So we have the get grid VDB operator, where we have to specify the OpenVDB container, and this will give us the fields that are available, and I can grab the field information. Remember, this operator is on top in the hierarchy, so we created the source box volume so we can grab the distance field from there, which is our source. because we specified the source particle, and the source particle has its own volume data attached to it. So the source particle has the volume data created from the source box volume. We feed that into our FractureVDB operator. It needs two volumes. The first volume is our main object, or the source object we want to cut, and the second volume is our cutter volume, so the big box, you remember. So we specify the cutter volume, so we feed in the cutter volume here. Now we have one interesting thing here. We have this strange construct with the on out here and on in, and then distance here and distance here. Keep in mind, these are two different volumes. So we might want to, so that we can easier understand what's going on, we say get source volume. So we know this will get our source volume, and we rename this to get cutter volume. So now we have these two things, and we can read a little bit better what's going on here. So we say get source volume, gets our source volume, we feed in the distance field, and we have the on output to activate the second get cutter volume. Because both are initiators, you can't have them parallel. So we couldn't do just them parallel without activating the other. So we first need to go through all the particles, because keep in mind, we're talking about particles. Right now we only have one particle, so that might look a little bit strange. But in theory, we could have thousands of volumes, thousands of these boxes, 100,000 of these boxes. So we have to go through each individual particle and do the relevant cutter volume as well. So we call this several times, then this is called several times, and so on. So this is why we have the on output here, and it activates this. And now at the same time we have both fields we need to do the fracture operation. The FractureVDB is a very powerful and interesting operator. It takes these two volumes and it cuts the main volume. So right now we set it to none, which means it takes the original object we specified. Keep in mind, let me just blend in or turn on the main box. That's our cutter object, which was turned into a volume. So you can see we get this nice cut. At the end, I have a velocity on these segments, on the individual parts. So if we animate this now, we can see that we get these individual cuts. And the interesting thing is that the fracture allows you to have several options to do cuts. That's the easiest, straightforward cut. You have your cutter volume, cut it through, done. That's the fracture. However, the fracture has also one or two more options. It has a random option and a particle group option. Let me just do the particle group option. And in the particle group option, you can see down here, we can select now a particle group. And from that particle group, we use the position and rotational information to place automatically or instance automatically the cutter volume. Remember, we have these two dummy objects here, and these two dummy objects supply now the cutter information. Let me just redo the simulation at frame 0, and you can see right now we have these two cuts based on our dummy objects. So if we animate now, you can see we have the cut. So why are they cut in that angle? Because our dummy objects are placed in that angle. So let me just go to very simple standard max operations. I'll just rotate it around a little bit, around this axis, and then I'll go back, we do a simulation, and then we get the new cut. And I think I did the rotation way out of the object. Here's now our rotation of the cut. So as you can see, it's a very powerful and efficient thing. And the great thing is we can have also any particles there. So we could have a particle cloud placing cutters, and then you do the calculation and you fracture your object and pre-cut your object in any way and style you want. And the great thing is this is volumetric. You will not run into any issues while cutting the object here. So that's another way to use the fracture system or operator. You can specify a particle group, and the rotation and alignment of these particles will be used to place your cutter volume. Also, the cutter volume could be multiple boxes assembled in one volume. It's just any volume you can use to cut another volume. Another interesting option we have in here is we can have random cuts. And random cuts will automatically place randomly in the object without any help of an object. It will randomly place the object in the volume and use it to cut the volume. Another important option we have here now is for all things, let me just play here a little bit with the segments here. You can see we have all the individual segments, and let's go back to the cutting. So right now we said we want 4 instances and we want to place them in with random variation. We could remove all randomness, including the randomness in the rotation. Let me do the simulation again. Then we get just the cuts like this, 4 cuts in this kind of placement direction. So let me just increase the steps through the object. Let's go back, and here we go. There you see we have this variations, and then we can have also a variation here by 30. And keep in mind we can also have random variations. Let's go back to 0 and rotate the angle a little bit randomly as I had here, so we get random cuts in our object. So the next thing is here we have cuts that are not respecting each other before. So they're cut and then forget. They're immediately taken out. You have an option for recut segments, and I'm going to simulate the recut segments as well. It now takes a little bit longer because it cuts and recuts the cuts as well. But you will see the difference now. We get much more cut object, and many more particles are created, or segments, individual segments are created along. So you can really cut your or fragment your object like crazy. And as I said, the calculation of these recut segments is a little bit tricky, but it works through. So if you have a complex object, you might have to run it for a minute or 2 minutes, and then you get your result. But it allows you to cut up an object like crazy without any issues at all for the final resulting object. So we can add maybe here another rotation. Let me just add oh, that's just a variation, sorry, excuse me. Another rotation here, and we can have here maybe -20. Oh, only positive. Okay, so let's just go back here. So now we have 2 axis random rotation, so we will get even a crazier cutting of our object, because now we rotate also in these axes. So now you get really a nice kind of debris, rock kind of debris, and really organic, natural looking things. And keep in mind, this is just a volume. You can pick another cutter and go through again, pick another cutter, go through again. It's crazy how you can pre-cut and create organic broken shapes out of your object here. So next to the, let me just turn that off, and go back to maybe 5. Let me simulate that again. Let's go to the next step. How do we decide which is the remaining and which is the segments or fragments? To get actually access to the fractured volume or to the segments of the volume, you need a segment VDB. So you need to have this segment VDB to actually access and create the particles for the individual segments. So just cutting the volume is fine and nice, but it will be still one volume. If you want to access the sub-volumes in this volume, you need to have the segment, and that will output you the segment particles, for example. And we assign to the segment particles the velocity, the random velocity to each particle. So we get the effect you see here. And this is an important step, because without the segment operator, you won't get the individual objects or access to the individual objects. And the segment VDB operator has also some interesting features and functions. And one interesting feature is, how do I sort, or how do I decide when we do the cuts, which is the remainder object, which is the cut? And we have a sort order by size down, so we can have the biggest object is always the remainder, the source object. The smallest ones are all cuts. Or we turn it around, and if I simulate again, you will see that it looks a little bit different. So now it's the opposite, and we let me just animate this. Okay, we cut everything right now. There's nothing left. And we can also do center outward, for example. Then we have the main object, or the source object remains, that is left over in the center, and outwards we will have the segments. And the same is center inward, and then it will pick randomly from outside a particle and just move inward with the cuts, with the segments. So and then there's up, down, and all kinds of things. Depends what you want to do in your visual effects. If you want to have a crumbling statue from top down, you would just use top down and the axis and all this. Then you need to specify where should these segments go. The segments go into our particle group called segments. So we have the segment particles as well, and then we can animate these particles, apply a force to it, and do whatever we want. And the attached volume to each particle will follow along and be placed. And then the same thing, we specify where do we store the volume of the segments, and we store it in the distance volume grid. Here we can access the segments. We have an output for the segments. As I said, we have a random velocity here with a variation. So we can get a variation on our segments. Let me just turn back to size down. So the biggest object remaining will always be our source object. And then we have the segments flying off. So the great thing now is we have the setup, so everything is cut. We can now access at each stage of our modification. We can access our volume and do additional modifications without redoing all the whole setup. So for example, if I wanted to round this object or smooth them out a little bit, let's smooth them out a little bit. I would just go in there and go to my signed distance field. That has the most operators for OpenVDB volumes. There's one called FilterVDB. It's a nice one, little but powerful operator. I'll just feed in the distance field. I'll turn off the distance field before the segment, and I'll feed in the field in here. So now when I control click, I can select multiple objects, and when I hold control, I can just move all the objects over here, just to make a little bit more space and clean that out. So what I did here Keep in mind, initially I had the direct connection without the filter. So the output of the fraction, that's our volume. It's still a volume. There's no mesh or anything. It's still a volume. The output of this FractureVDB operator is my volume, my initial volume with all the segmented volume in there. And I'm now going to filter it. Let me just use a Gaussian filter because it's a very strong filter. And now let's just simulate again. And you see we rounded all the volumes and objects. And these filters also dependent on your volume, voxel size and all this kind of things. But you get the idea. Now everything is rounded and smooth. We can choose a box filter, which is not that strong, so we get less rounding or smoothing around the edges. And we can also choose between a mean curvature function that gets closer and gives us just the edges a little bit smooth and the flat surface is a little bit smoother. And another one is the Laplacian. These are just smoothing filters that will give you different smoothing, and one might work better than the other. For fluids, I always use the Gaussian filter because that's the most efficient and powerful filter we have there. And we could also apply, let me just simulate this filter again. So that's the rounding. And if we overdo it, let's say I put it to 3 iterations. So the filter will go now 3 times over the volume. We get this kind of things out, which is nonsense in that case. And we even can turn off the filter completely, which would not make sense because then I don't need to put it in here. So keep in mind what we did here. We worked on the volume and not on the mesh. So the output of our FractureVDB is still there because it's the output, the distance field, and we just smooth out the whole distance field. I'm connecting back the distance field to the segment, so we get back to our old result. Here, everything we go in here, I'll grab this segment volume field and volume grids, and we apply the set grid. And the set grid is important. We want to commit the change of our volume, so we apply the filter, these filter here, we use a box filter, and this filter right now is only attached to the segments. So the original, the source object, will not be filtered. So let me just rerun the simulation, and you see only the segments get filtered and our original object is untouched. There's no filtering, no rounding happening on this object. So that's the power we have here with the OpenVDB volumes. At any point you can jump in and modify the volume until it is output at the very end with a volume to shape. And this volume to shape turns the volume, whatever it is, whatever modifications you did, back into a shape. And you should make sure that your volume to shape in the end is also at the very end of your dynamic set, because it's the last process. After you've done all the modifications, the volume to shape will turn your mesh into your volume into a mesh representation. So we have now here our volume representation of all the operations we did, and the volume to shape creates the mesh. And here we can apply a relax on the whole mesh. So now, thanks for watching the live stream, and I hope you will check out our other videos, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop the stream now.